Welcome to the Anne Arundel County Police Department. What you are about to hear are real stories, told by some of the men and women who lived through them. Join us as we examine active, closed, and sometimes cold cases with an occasional look behind the badge. Our mission is to be informative and engaging with the goal of providing justice and just maybe closure to our victims and their families. I'm Chris Anderson, and this is the Crime Journal. Hey, and welcome to the show. I am your host, Chris Anderson, and you're listening to the Crime Journal. Today's episode is going to go in a much different direction than previous cases we featured on the show. This is part one of a three-part episode. We're going to take you as deep into the case as we can, from the crime itself to the evidence, through the investigation and the discovery that brought answers to an unsolved mystery. It's Tuesday, February 2nd, 2010. Winter has taken a foothold and a wintry blanket of snow has fallen in the small Woodwardville community in the heart of Odenton, Maryland. It's late in the evening when Margaret Ridgely and Michael Temple return to their home on Williamsburg Lane. The unsuspecting couple would have no reason to know that within minutes, their whole world would be turned upside down. Once again, I am joined by my co-host, Lieutenant Jackie Davis.
Happy to be back, Chris.
Detective Regina Collier.
That's Sergeant Regina Collier to
Sergeant
you.
Detective.
Well, thank you for having me back again.
So let's go ahead and dive right in. We're going to go back to 2010. Can you kind of tell us initially what happened with the call that Western received?
Well, it was actually February 2nd, 2010 at 8:54 p.m. Western District officers, they responded to a call for a home invasion shooting that occurred at 522 Williamsburg Lane in Odenton.
This is Anne Arundel County 911. Do you need police, fire, or ambulance?
Oh, somebody just tried to rob us and shot my fiancé twice.
What was this?
Right now?
Where are you? And what's the nearest street corner to you?
Sorry, what?
Your nearest intersecting street.
The traffic circle, Odenton Road.
All right, what happened?
Two people with masks came in here, and they tried to rob us.
Inside your house?
Yes, they came inside my grandmother's house, and they shot my boyfriend twice. He can't move.
Okay, hold on a minute. Let me get a paramedic on the line, too. Stay on the line.
Oh, God, please help me.
Hang on, we're getting you help.
Please help.
3 to 5, Charlie 3, 5 Robert 3, start priority 1 for home invasion. Just occurred. There's also a shooting involved. Still waiting on further.
Ready to advise there was shooting involved?
Notes are advising that this is also going to be a shooting.
So when the officers got there, what did they find?
Well, when the officers arrived on the scene, they found a male in... This occurred in the basement.
Okay.
So he was in the laundry room area. He was in a closet, and he was shot. So we have the one injured male in the closet. We have an injured female who was the 911 caller, because I do recognize her voice.
So she was injured as well?
Yes, she was injured. And then there was another gentleman who they found in a adjacent bedroom in the basement, room, basically it was a TV watching room, that he was also tied up. And then we had a witness down in the basement also.
Wow, so there was a lot of people on this scene when you guys got there.
Yes, and so the officers had to sort out what happened, who saw what, and who knew what information.
So who were the victims then? What victims did you guys have?
Well, the victims that we had Michael Temple. Michael Temple was identified as the male who was in the laundry room closet, and he was shot. We had his girlfriend, who was the 911 caller you just heard, who is Margaret Ridgely. And then we had Margaret's great uncle, Mr. Donald Gagnon, and he was in the adjacent room, and he was tied up, and he was also, we found out that he was hit in the head before being tied up with duct tape, and he had his wallet stolen at that time. And then we had a witness, Miss Kelly Skarwecki.
Wow, so there was the one victim, Michael Temple, who had been shot multiple times. You had Uncle Donald, who had some type of a head injury, and what were Kelly's injuries?
Kelly actually had a laceration above her left eye.
So who is Kelly?
Kelly is a friend of Margaret's.
Okay.
And that's why she was at the residence.
Gotcha.
Okay, so when the officers first responded, did detectives come out right away, or when did the detectives get involved? And was that, and for people who aren't familiar with the way that our particular department operates, we have district-level detectives, and then we have our CID detectives, which are more specialized. So is it like a all hands on deck, or is it, how did that work that night?
Well, with this case, it was Michael's injuries were significant enough that first arriving officers got on the scene. And the first thing we do is call out the district detectives because it was a shooting. They weren't sure at that point how significant Michael's injuries were. But because of his injuries and what we were hearing from the fire department that also arrived and were assessing him and all, both the district detective units and the homicide units were both called out that night to come to the residence.
Yeah. So and let's focus, I guess, first on Michael Temple. Who is Michael Temple, or who was Michael Temple? Like, what did we know about him, or what did we learn about him that night?
Well, that night we did learn that Michael Temple had been living there for approximately 6 months. We found out that residence was Margaret's grandmother's residence. And Michael and Margaret had been together for approximately 3.5 years. And they were supposed to get married. So they were living there, and Michael had gotten laid off from his job. And due to that, they decided that they were going to sell narcotics to make the ends meet and pay their bills. So they started running their own little business out of the basement of this residence.
So Michael Temple, the most severely injured boyfriend, Margaret, girlfriend, but it was actually her grandmother's house that they were living in.
Wow, and grandmother was home or no?
Actually, she was home. The grandmother, Miss Mildred Wolf, it was her residence, and she was home. And the way the house is, it's a split foyer. Mm-hmm. So all this happened in the basement. And Miss Mildred was upstairs in the upstairs level. She didn't see her or hear anything. Unfortunately, she did have some medical conditions, which was the reason originally that Margaret had moved in to help her grandmother along.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier a witness, Kelly.
Yes.
Who is Kelly, and what did she say?
Kelly is a friend of Margaret's, and actually she was also a customer of theirs.
Okay.
So she was there. She came there because she was waiting for what was told. She was waiting for a money transfer, and she had to use her computer.
Okay.
So she came into the residence. There was some strange things there that night with Kelly because she left her child out in the car while she came inside.
Okay.
And she usually doesn't do that. And they were supposed to meet Kelly somewhere else originally that night, and then Kelly kind of changed plans, and they met at that residence.
Hello?
Yes, hi, 911 emergency.
Yes, somebody's been shot here. I don't even know the address. I'm here. Oh my God.
Okay, ma'am, calm down.
Oh my God.
Calm down, okay? Okay, ma'am, try to keep yourself as calm as possible. Look around you. Are you...
I just ran in the house. My daughter was in the car. Thank God my daughter was in the car.
Okay, ma'am, is someone there injured?
Yes, hold on. I'm getting my daughter out of the EMT. I have to go in and get
Okay, I'm going to get the paramedics on the line.
So that was
Hold on.
Kelly we just heard also calling 911.
Yes, both Margaret and Kelly both called 911 that night.
Okay, and you said earlier that Kelly was uninjured in this attack.
Yes, for some reason, she was at the computer. She saw everything happen, yet no one advanced on her or did anything to her.
Which is kind of strange because you said earlier that the uncle who was in an adjacent bedroom was attacked and something happened with him, correct?
Yes.
Can you talk about that a little bit more?
Well, from what we learned through talking, through interviews that night, is that the uncle, he was in watching TV, and the two suspects came into the residence. He stood up from the TV. They went right towards him, hit him in the head, and then he fell to the ground. Then his hands were duct taped and his legs were duct taped, and they stole his wallet, which had $60 in it. And then they went into his side bedroom there in the residence in the basement.
Okay.
So it's the timing. They could have been waiting for Margaret and Michael to come home at that point, or I think that possibly because the time was so close between when they did that to the uncle to when they went into the main bedroom where everyone else was.
Okay.
That they probably just tried to get him out of the way so they didn't have to worry about coming back and bothering with him later.
So I assume that means to you guys when they enter with a plan that it potentially was somebody that had already been in that residence at some point before. They were familiar with the layout, it appeared.
That's what we believe.
Gotcha. Now, at the time, was there a neighborhood canvass done? Were there any other witnesses to this?
There was a neighborhood canvass done, and we routinely do neighborhood canvasses on our cases, and sometimes, you end up with nothing. Sometimes you end up with some good information. So we did have some good information that night. There was a witness who saw an unknown vehicle that was parked on the street. In these older neighborhoods, the citizens, they can tell what cars belong there and what don't.
They know
what
their
cars
neighbors.
do not.
Know their
Especially
neighbors.
on a very snowy evening where people wouldn't just be out driving around randomly anyway. One neighbor did notice that there was a silver truck parked across the street from the residence that what he did not recognize, and the vehicle parked right before he started hearing the sirens. And then when he heard the sirens, the vehicle was gone.
Odenton Police.
Yes, there seems to be a lot of squad cars and ambulances about 2 doors down. And I saw something earlier that I thought was suspicious, but I didn't know if this was just a person injured or if this was like some kind of crime committed.
Well, what do you mean suspicious?
Well, I saw 2 guys roll up in a truck. I'd say probably around 8:30ish, and walk over to the house that everybody's at.
Okay.
And then they rolled out of there and left.
Okay.
Did they give any type of description of the 2 gentlemen other than what we just heard that witness call in?
Margaret was able to describe the 2 gentlemen. She described them as 2 males. They both were wearing masks, had their face covered. One was a little taller than the other. She believed medium build. One had a handgun, and the other had a folding knife. And in her interview about the suspect who had a handgun, she described his eyes, which are very important down the line, because she described how green his eyes were and how they were piercing and beautiful.
Interesting.
But neither of the victims ever described saying, I distinctly remember them saying this, or I recognize their voice, or the way that they carried themselves, or their mannerisms. So they described them as by their physical appearance, but they weren't able to say, hey, I could potentially be familiar with this person.
Exactly. They didn't say anything that made them think, oh, I know who that is, or anything like that at all.
And they never went down the path of, hey, we were expecting, John Smith, or they never said that they, had any idea of who it could have been. They didn't try to lead detectives down like a certain path towards anyone in particular.
No, they weren't expecting anyone. From time to time, they did have people drop by looking to make a deal, but they'd had nothing set up.
And when they were describing them, did they say that both men were armed? One man was. Did they go down that path of information?
It was described that the shorter one had a handgun and the taller one had a folding knife.
You talked a little bit earlier and said that everything happened on the lower level of this home. Do we know how, and that Grandma was upstairs, do we know how the suspects got in the house? Did they have to walk through the front door? Did they climb in a window? Or what's the entry point here, if we know?
Well, actually, we do know because it was snowing that night, so they left footprints in the snow.
Okay.
So what they did is they went around to the side of the residence into the back and went into the basement door and went through the basement door and came in through that entrance.
Gotcha. Okay, and then you said, we talked a little bit about this, but maybe you could describe it a little bit more. it seems to me that they came in, with a plan, with an intent, kind of with a mental map, if you will, of where they were going to go. Is there any significance to that at all? With it being a home invasion at first and then a shooting. Can you talk a little bit more about the actual incident itself?
Sure. Well, they did come in with a plan. Basically, their plan was to rob Michael and Margaret.
Okay.
Because these people knew what they have in that residence. They knew that, they had their business going. They knew they routinely have the CDS, and they routinely have money. In fact, when they came in, they pointed the gun at Michael, and the other one threw Margaret to the ground, and they were yelling, "Open the safe." So they knew exactly where they were going.
And they knew there was a safe, yep.
Exactly. So they knew where they kept things.
Okay.
And they knew what they were going there for. So this was planned to basically rob them.
Gotcha. So what happened then? They throw Margaret to the floor, they're pointing the gun at Michael, telling him to open the safe, and...
Yes. And Margaret and Michael, they're scrappers. So the fight was on. So Margaret was on the ground fighting the taller suspect,
okay,
who had the knife, and Michael was fighting the shorter one. And what we learned that Michael had actually told Margaret later was that Michael had gotten up and ran out of the bedroom that they were in where the fight was occurring and ran towards the laundry room trying to get the two suspects, or at least the suspect with the gun, away from Margaret.
Oh,
so
wow.
that's how he wound up in the other room.
Okay, so he runs out towards the laundry room, laundry closet, whatever it is.
Yes.
The suspect with the gun follows him.
Yes, and so Margaret is still on the ground. She's being choked by the other suspect. And then they hear a pop.
Okay.
And then...
What's the pop?
The pop is Michael being shot. And then they stop for a second, and then they hear a second one. And then the suspect that's on top of Michael gets up, and he goes to the other room to see what's going on. And Margaret is right behind him.
So the suspect strangling Margaret gets off of Margaret and goes to check on the other two.
Yes.
And then Margaret obviously follows, trying to figure out what happened to her fiancé.
Yes.
Okay.
So the four of them wind up in that back laundry room, and Margaret is yelling and pleading with them, "Please don't do this. Please don't do this."
Yeah.
And the suspect, the taller suspect, says to the shorter suspect to shoot her.
Wow.
And at that point, the shorter suspect takes the gun. He points it at Margaret. She closes her eyes and keeps pleading, and a shot goes off, but luckily does not hit her. And then when she opens her eyes, they run out the back door.
Wow. Okay, so do we know any more details? We got what's going on with Margaret and the tall suspect in the bedroom. While those shots are going off between our suspect and Michael, what's going on with that fight?
What we learn is that the first shot goes off, and then Michael, who, because of his business, he does carry a knife himself.
Okay.
So what he does is he pulls out his knife and he stabs the suspect.
Oh.
So that's why the second shot went off, because the suspect got shot.
So he
stabbed.
He shoots Michael. Michael stabs him, so he shoots him again.
Yes.
Wow.
And actually we found out when Michael was removed by the fire department, when he was actually removed, we did find 2 .357 shell casings underneath him.
Wow. Okay. So
And
that
do
was
we-
quite a
And
fight.
we also found a knife with blood on it, which
Michael's knife.
turned out to
Yeah.
be Michael's.
So we hear that this happened. Was there any sort of part in the investigation where you believed that they came there with that intent, or do we think that this is just something that got out of hand and the shooting ended up happening, like it was never meant to happen? They didn't come there with, the hostile intentions of murdering, Michael Temple. They just, it just happened.
I think it was just a robbery that got out of hand.
Yeah.
There's nothing that points to intentions of that was their intent going there that night.
I think you could argue that second shot was intentional.
True.
And then we go back to the witness, Kelly. You had mentioned earlier that they were initially supposed to meet her somewhere else. And then somehow she ends up bringing them back to their house or making it to where they have to come back to their house, was there any sort of indication for detectives that she had any involvement whatsoever and that she had sort of been in cahoots with the two suspects or anything like that?
Of course, at that time, we look into everything. So the detectives at the time, they looked into everything, looked into Kelly, looked into all her associates and things like that. And it did turn out this was just happened to happen.
Wow. And
that she didn't have any control of setting anything up.
it sounds like there is an overwhelming amount of physical evidence clearly at the scene. I mean, Lieutenant Davis, you were also a homicide detective. What does that look like to investigators?
Go ahead. You can go.
Okay.
Go ahead, Gene.
You can answer for her.
I can talk about it. No, I'm sorry. I thought you were talking to Sergeant Collier. No, I mean, evidence is how we solve crimes, right? And collecting that evidence is how we solve crimes. It's how our prosecutors are able to secure convictions. And in part 3 of this, we'll get into that a little bit more.
And luckily, we have a phenomenal ECU staff, and they did a fantastic job that night by securing everything in the scene, and then even the outer perimeter that we had, the outside scene, because when the suspects ran out, as we know now, one was stabbed. There was blood in the snow that we were able to collect.
Anne Arundel County Police, may I help you?
The scene of, well, actually 2 doors down from last night's events.
What happened last night?
There was, I guess, a break-in shooting.
Okay, do you have information on this?
Well, one of the officers came to my door. He took my name and number. I was out shoveling snow this morning, and I see some blood droplets in the snow on my next-door neighbor's drive. So I've left them there, but it's melting.
So, as a former homicide detective, finding blood is very exciting. And I'm sure it is for any detective looking for a suspect, because we all know blood has DNA. Was this DNA helpful to detectives at the time?
At the time, the DNA was put in CODIS.
What does that mean?
Which is the database that we can put our suspect DNA in, and we can run it to see if anyone has been convicted of a felony before, and if their DNA is in a database, it will collect. But I'm sure Sarah will explain all that later down the line.
Right. So we did have DNA that was collected from the scene, but that DNA led to a dead end at the time, is what you're saying.
At the time, we had no hit on it.
Interesting.
So we go back to them collecting anything and everything that they can possibly collect that they think might help during the investigation. What about the injuries to both victims? We heard that Michael was shot, but I don't believe it ended there. What were his physical injuries as a result of the shooting?
Well, Michael's injuries, he did have a gunshot wound in his right armpit and one on his back left shoulder. Unfortunately, that left him a quadriplegic. So basically, from 2010 to 2015, he had a very painful life for 5 years.
Physically and emotionally.
Yes, definitely, because he had to rely on others to take care of him for everything. And as a young man, I don't think anyone would want that.
I don't know if we said this or not, but 2015 is when Michael actually died from these injuries.
Yes.
Gotcha. So he was shot in 2010, then suffered for 5 whole years as a quadriplegic, as not being able to do anything for himself. What does that do to somebody? How does that re-victimize somebody every single day?
It destroys your life, which is
Goodness.
basically what it did to Michael, unfortunately. Unfortunately, him and Margaret wound up splitting. His father had to take care of him for all those years. And Michael himself had some addiction problems, and then because of what he had been through, they're giving him more pain medicine, and you have to worry about infections and things like that. It was just a very long road.
Yeah, that's horrific. And I think sometimes in cases like these where we have multiple victims, sometimes the quote unquote lesser of the victims kind of get forgotten. But there was a lot of people victimized by these suspects that night. You know, they tried to assassinate Margaret. She has to live with that every time she closes her eyes. The uncle was assaulted and duct taped, like something you see out of an action movie. It's crazy, and having to live with that in your own home. I don't know how anybody in that house that night is able to carry on any type of comfortable, normal life after that.
Yes, everyone in that house was victimized, and it's just very hard to wrap your head around and be able to figure out how you're going to move on from day to day.
And then you hit on it just a few moments ago. Michael Temple ended up passing in June of 2015, so it becomes a homicide investigation at that point. How did that event kind of change the direction of the case? And if you could talk a little bit about your personal involvement, when did you personally become involved in the case? Because I know that's not how it works, and if you could kind of explain how case management works when it goes from, maybe that district level or whoever was assisting. It was like a concerted effort between district and CID, and now it's become a homicide, so it's kind of bumped up. And, how does it work through each detective, and how does each detective, kind of pass that information to the oncoming detective?
Basically, it's a lot of meetings.
Yeah.
We have a lot of meetings. We meet up and we look through everyone's old notes. And then you bring people in, you re-interview people and see if there's anything now that they can remember that maybe they were too traumatized at that time that they blocked it out and couldn't even remember. So what we did is we re-interviewed everyone, and that's where we started again from. And
was that in 2015 when you became involved personally with the case, or did you get involved prior to that?
Basically, I became involved in 2015,
okay.
Me and Detective DePietro.
And I guess up to that point, I'm assuming, since we haven't discussed it, no significant leads, no red herrings, no, hey, we believe this person did it, this is what we've been searching, or how much information was there up until that point over that 5-year period?
No, unfortunately, we didn't have any leads. We did put out the informational flyers. We put it out, just anyone with information, please let us know. But at that point, we did not have anything that we could go on.
So we talked about this a little bit earlier. I think a lot of people think, hey, you got the suspect's DNA, you got him. Hey, you got the suspect's fingerprint, you got him. Hey, we got him on camera, you got him. And that's just not the case for some of these investigations. So we had this blood, we had this DNA. It was a dead end at the time. What did our evidence collection do with that? Where does that blood go? What do we do?
Basically, we store it and we keep it until we can use it, because luckily throughout these years, technology has really gotten better, and we can rerun things, and we can test something again. And now with the better markings and things like that, and just the way that science is, we can hopefully get an answer and put, people's questions to rest.
How many years from the time Michael Temple was shot in 2010? He died in 2015, that's 5. How many years after that until we got a break?
2018, 3 years.
So over that 5-year period between February of 2010 and June of 2015, detectives exhausted every means, avenue, and path of investigative methods without much happening in the direction of significant progress. Then one day, in 2018, a cold case detective learns of a new investigative technique that would end up revealing everything. Join us next time for part 2 to hear about the breakthrough in the Michael Temple case and how it not only affected this particular investigation, but how it would change homicide and violent crime investigations nationwide.